battle in the heart of Alabama caught our attention. Coal miners in one community, they've been on strike now for months.
Working as long as 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, in some of the most dangerous conditions.
I really think that the labor movement is the single greatest force for democracy in the history of the United States.
The story of Alabama is a story of not just resilience, but of militancy.
I said no contract, you said no code. No contract, no contract.
If we ain't all free, ain't none of us free.
You're listening to Alabama's only union talk radio show, The Valley Labor Report, with Adam Keller and Jacob Morrison.
Hello, Tennessee Valley. You are listening to a very special episode of the Valley Labor Report in double overtime, released on YouTube the day after Christmas for your listening pleasure. My name is Jacob Morrison. My co-host is Adam Keller, and today we're bringing you a few older clips that we dug up while getting some best ofs that did not quite fit into our regular programming. But we did the research, we dug into the archives, and we still wanted to share it with you. So today we've got an interview that I really enjoyed at the time, but I thought didn't get enough love when it went live, and that's the history of mass picketing in the United States with Professor Ahmed White. We're also going to be getting another history lesson on Blair Mountain from Dr. Chuck Keeney, and we're gonna get some bad boss stories and more today in our special double overtime program. So something that really saddens me is that callers have gotten most animated about immigration. If I'm thinking back through some of the angry calls that we get, I don't know that I've gotten more angry reactions than I have to immigration. That really is an issue that folks have just been programmed to react poorly to. And react poorly they did. In this clip where we had on immigration attorney Stephen Robbins, also known as Ronald Reagan to the Majority Report audience. And I think that he responds better than I could have. So with that context out of the way, here's the clip.
We did get a caller. We've only got about 10 minutes left with Stephen. So we've got Lee on the line. Lee, where are you calling from?
Huntsville.
Lee from Huntsville. What's your question?
Just curious, not even going to comment on the loose back and forth between undocumented, documented, as if there's not that much difference, which of course there is. But my question for you is, if you give a $15 wage for agricultural work, how are the rest of us going to afford the produce at that cost level? Because it will drive the cost up exponentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, to your first comment, the distinction between undocumented and documented workers, I think it's really important for people to understand how arbitrary it is who gets and who doesn't get papers in this country. People can get papers if they've been here, maybe they've been here illegally or undocumented for over 10 years, and then they end up in removal proceedings. They can end up winning a green card. That's technically a right way to do it. Other people have been here 20 years and paid taxes and done everything above board, but there's no way for them to get papers. And so, I hear what you're saying, but I also think that we need to really look at the system as it is and to understand that the people who end up in one basket or the other, it's not due to merit. It's due to a random sort of patchwork of bad laws that need to be updated. In terms of
I don't disagree with that. I don't disagree with that. But I do think we should have a better expanded worker program where they can come and then exit our country, because I don't think that people coming here, we can't support the entire world. So there needs to be a better way for people to come in and be able to work and leave. So we don't need to be supporting these people with our social programs. That should be reserved for the citizens of our country. That's just my opinion. But tell me about how we would stop the increase in the cost.
The increase in produce prices. I think that anytime that you look at an economy that says, in order for us to have something that we need, like food, other people have to live in abject poverty, and that's just the way that it has to be. We need to really take a closer look at that, right? And so, first of all, I don't know that it's true that the prices would go up all that much if we raised wages. I don't think that I've ever seen the growers actually present the math on that. We hear things like that about the $15 minimum wage all the time, but then you look at places like Seattle where they've implemented a $15 minimum wage and prices have not increased in any significant way. And then the other thing, like I was mentioning to Jacob earlier, if the president can get us into a trade war and we can come up with tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars to just give to the farmers, and it doesn't register on anyone's radar, nobody cares, then certainly if we saw a situation where farm workers were making $15 an hour and produce prices started to go up, there's no reason why that same type of money couldn't be used to either subsidize the cost of food or to subsidize the workers directly. So I understand the concern, but also I want you to step back and think to yourself, wait a minute, what I'm saying is that in order for me to eat, we need to have impoverished people in this country.
Impoverished people in this country for a season and then kick them back out is what she said, actually.
Right. And so, we need to be better than that. And it's not a right-left thing. It's not a liberal conservative thing. It's just, hey, you know what? I don't want the guy who comes to fix my kitchen to have to, live on poverty wages, or I don't want somebody who cuts my lawn to have to live on poverty wages. I think that people who work hard should live with dignity, right? And so if that's not happening, or if I think that that's necessary, then we need to take a step back and think about how we can fix that.
Right. Yeah. Just because something is a certain way doesn't mean that it has to be that way. That's certain. We've got one more caller. Jeff, where are you calling from?
Jeff from New Orleans. How you doing?
Jeff from New Orleans. What's your question?
Hey, I was calling to talk a little bit about how workers who don't have immigration status are also misclassified often as where they would often have jobs where they would be an employee, they would get misclassified as an independent contractor. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that impacts how these workers are treated?
I actually don't know too much about that, and maybe you do, and I'd love to hear more about that. But I don't know too much about that issue. Okay. I do know what Jacob mentioned earlier about ICE being called at the end of a successful organization effort. I've definitely heard those stories, and those kinds of things definitely happen to undocumented workers.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that I guess I have some friends that work for the Great New Orleans AFL-CIO, and they talk about how immigration status is often leveraged against these workers, so that when they would technically have the same rights as other workers too, when they're on the work site, they're sort of influenced to not exercise those rights. And I just wanted to really quickly plug one other thing. Which is like the PRO Act would be something which is going through Congress. It's already been passed through the House. That would sort of really, really push against that kind of a force. It would make it much more difficult to misclassify those workers. There's stiffer penalties for that. So.
Yeah, Jeff, Stephen mentioned this to me before the show, which is that and I knew this, but I had forgotten it, that the NLRA doesn't cover agricultural work. And so I can't recall if the PRO Act actually, the PRO Act is an amendment to the NLRA. And so I can't recall if I can't apply. Yeah, I'm not sure if the PRO Act amends it to cover agricultural work, and I guess, Stephen, since you haven't heard much about what the PRO Act would do to ag workers, I'm kind of assuming that it doesn't actually do that.
Right. Yeah, I don't think it does, but it's an interesting point. I think more broadly, and to the last caller's point too, the Farm Workforce Modernization Act still treats undocumented workers like criminals. It finds them and puts them on this long, laborious path to a green card. But nowhere does it say anything about holding the farmers accountable for employing people who they knew were undocumented. And so, I don't see quite enough progress on that front of, holding, the employers to account, but hopefully the PRO Act, provides a little bit more rights to the workers.
Yeah, and Lee, if you're... Oh, no, yeah, and Lee, if you're still listening, actually, as far as you mentioned about immigrants, taking advantage of our social programs, so to speak, I wrote an article some time ago. I just published it on Medium, and if you follow me on Twitter at @JacobM_AL, I'll tweet that article out again. I did a lot of digging, and actually, like, if you compare similarly situated immigrants, documented and undocumented, they use significantly less social programs than similarly situated native workers. That is just not up for dispute. And additionally, their children, the firstborn children of immigrant workers, actually bring in more tax revenue than any other group of Americans at all. I mean, it's really fascinating how much more how much more than a third or fourth or fifth generation American. It's fascinating how much a first-generation American citizen, the children of immigrants, contribute more to our tax coffers than any other group. It's really a lot. So if you follow me, I'll tweet that out after the show on Twitter at @JacobM_AL. Stephen and Jeff, thanks for the call. I appreciate it. I think, and I'm pretty sure Jeff is actually the host of Good Morning Comrade, which is another show on WHIV in New Orleans. And he actually put me in touch with Dr. Deary, the founder of the station. So, Stephen, we've got about a minute left. I really appreciate your time. You've been very generous. I've enjoyed the conversation. I hope folks have learned some stuff. What are some of your closing thoughts on this subject, and where can people find you?
I'm on the Twitter, just like you. Yakima Abogado is my Twitter handle. The podcast is called Redirect. I appreciate the call from Lee, and she has some concerns. But again, I really hope that people can just start to see these people as people, right? They're hardworking for the most part. Obviously, they're like everybody else, and they just want an opportunity to feed their kids, to live with dignity, and to be a part of our community. And so I think that as Americans, we can do a better job of providing that.
In this older clip from 2021, we talked to Dr. Chuck Keeney from West Virginia, and he gave us a quick history lesson about what happened at Blair Mountain.
So we've got about 2 minutes left, and one more question on this, on the kind of the backstory and the ideological fight, and then I want to get into what actually happened with the mine wars. But lay out really quickly, what are those two competing visions of liberty that were kind of at war at the Battle of Blair Mountain?
Well, in the Battle of Blair Mountain, it's number one, it's the ideals of free market, laissez-faire capitalism on one hand, and a more equitable idea on the other hand. I mean, you had a big mix of ideals. It would be incorrect to say that all the miners were ideologically the same that joined this rebellion. However, there were a lot of socialists that were involved. The Socialist Party for a while in West Virginia had some power, and then they had some popularity in West Virginia. And believe it or not, a lot of evangelical Christians were socialists in West Virginia, which if I were to go to a church and say that tomorrow morning, a lot of people's heads would explode because they wouldn't connect to themselves with that. And so it's those two main overarching ideas.
Dr. Keeney, thank you. We're going to be right back. Talk some more.
Let's go!
right, folks, welcome back to the Valley Labor Report. My name is Jacob Morrison, here with my co-host David Story. On the line, we've got Dr. Chuck Keeney. He is a West Virginia historian and a founding member of the Mine Wars Museum.
And author of The Road to Blair Mountain.
Author of The Road to Blair Mountain. So let's talk about The Road to Blair Mountain, as in want to talk about the book a little bit later, but the actual so give us the backstory before this big battle. Lay the groundwork for us. What was the kind of historical circumstances around this battle?
Okay, so West Virginia, of course, by the 1880s, they begin to understand through geologic surveys that there's a whole lot of coal in West Virginia. And outside investors begin to come in and begin buying up all of the land, taking the land a lot of times from native mountaineers that had been here for a while. My family among them. My family lost 2,000 acres to the coal industry in around 1883, 1884. And this happened to a lot of mountain families that had been around for a while. They lost their land and found themselves working in coal camps. And so the coal industry comes in, and they do, in some ways, kind of a hostile takeover of the state, in which they control the politics, the judges, the land, and they build up these little coal towns in which they operate these towns independently. And I think you guys are probably familiar with the company town structure. But in West Virginia, you had the highest percentage of coal miners living in company towns than in any other state.
Company towns that some
close to 90% of all West Virginia coal miners lived on company property. The second highest state was Illinois with about 48%. So twice as many from a ratio, twice as many in West Virginia were living in company towns, which means they had a company town, you had a company store, company church, company money, company saloon. You get the point. They had their mail opened. They had their ballots filled out for them on election day. They also had the brutal mine guard system, the security forces that companies would have. And they were brutal. They spied on people. They posed as saloon keepers. They posed as miners. They spied on people. They beat up potential union organizers. You could be beat up and lose your job for possessing the wrong kind of literature, a United Mine Workers Journal, so on and so forth. And then eventually the miners themselves, fight back. And you don't just have native white miners, of course. You have a lot of immigrants that are brought in, African Americans that come up from the South. And they all are stuck in these little company towns together. And ultimately, they end up joining forces and try to unionize. Many of them become socialists. The Socialist Party became rather popular in a lot of coal camps. My great-grandfather was a socialist. And had a number of little socialist mayors in towns that were incorporated towns right off company property. You often had a little socialist mayor right off company property. You had this on the Pink Creek, Cabin Creek strike. So anyway, around 1912, the miners tried to organize. Now, these were big stakes for the United Mine Workers, and the reason it was because you had the UMWA had been successful in organizing the Central Bituminous Field a couple of years before 1912, and this was, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. However, West Virginia coal operators, because they were able to keep the union out, they were able to undersell these coal operators in the Central Bituminous Field. They were able to sell coal cheaper. And they were running these other co-operators out of business. So the co-operators of the Central Bituminous Field told the UMWA, if you don't organize West Virginia, we're cutting our union contracts. So the UMWA had to organize West Virginia in order to stay viable as an organization. The co-operators of West Virginia felt that they had to keep the union out in order to outcompete co-operators in other states. So from the very beginning, these are extremely high stakes. And they go on strike. Everybody's evicted from their homes. They live in tent colonies. And the miners begin organizing themselves into guerrilla warfare units. My great-grandfather was in one of those called the Dirty 11. And they blew up tipples, they tore up railroad tracks, they attacked scabs, then they attacked mine guards. There were pitched battles that took place in the Pink Creek, Cabin Creek strike in which, 15 people would be killed in one battle, 10 in another, 16 in another. Mother Jones, of course, the very famous National Union organizer, comes to West Virginia. They ultimately win the Pink Creek, Cabin Creek strike and bring the Union into the Kanawha coal fields. And Frank Keeney, who became the leader, him and Fred Mooney, who became the two big leaders during that strike. And they weren't union organizers. They were just miners who just took it over themselves. Yeah. And they become the Union leadership in West Virginia. During World War I, they successfully organized the whole state except for 3 counties, Mingo, McDowell, and Logan County, the southernmost coal counties. And these were high coal producing counties, but they couldn't organize them because of the heavily entrenched mine guard system that was there. And so they had this unionizing drive after World War I. Things get even more violent. Mingo County becomes known as Bloody Mingo. You had a lot of events known as the Battle of Matewan, sometimes called the Matewan Massacre, that's a very famous gunfight that took place. You had the 3 days Battle of the Tug, a 3-day battle along the Tug River on the Kentucky-West Virginia border that killed in excess of 30 people. We really don't know the exact number of people. In a lot of these gunfights, we really don't know exactly how many people were killed. And they declared martial law in Mingo County. They brought in troops. And they began arresting miners. They cut off the family's food supplies that were living in the tent colonies. And ultimately, 2 individuals, Sid Hatfield and Ed Chambers, one of them was a chief of police in Matewan, and his deputy were murdered on the McDowell County courthouse steps by mine guards. And that was kind of the spark that led to miners in the other coal fields decide, we're going to march from Charleston down into these counties and forcibly drive the mine guards out and release the miners that were prisoners and bring food and supplies to the people that were living in these tent colonies. The Lick Creek tent colony had become known by that time as Labor's Valley Forge. And just appalling conditions families were living in. And so they were trying to march south to Mingo County to drive out the mine guards. But in between Mingo County and Charleston was Logan County. And there was a series of ridge lines that kind of made a natural fortress about 5 or 6 miles north of Logan, town of Logan. And this is where the sheriff of Logan County and the mine guard set up defensive entrenchments along a 12-mile front on these ridge lines, beginning at Blair Mountain and going up to Mill Creek. It's called the Battle of Blair Mountain, but the battle was much bigger than the actual mountain. Okay, it took place along a 12-mile front for 5 days. And miners, it started out with about 5,000 miners. The numbers may have swelled up to around 15,000. They were organized. We don't have time to get into the organization of it, but in August 1921 is when they begin marching south. They fight this 5-day pitched battle between company forces and state troopers and the miners themselves who were organized. Of course, the miners wore red bandanas around their necks. That had been a tradition that had been going on for quite a while at that time, and were referred to as rednecks as a result of that. That's not the exact origin of the term redneck, but in West Virginia, if you said redneck, that meant a Union man at the time. But because the miners didn't control the press, they didn't control the media, they were portrayed as backward, ignorant hillbillies, and the term redneck kind of became associated with someone who's backward and ignorant. Because the miners themselves didn't control the media. But to them, the red bandana meant Union solidarity. That's what the term meant. And it has become this kind of scarlet thread throughout West Virginia history. Teachers, when they went on strike in 2018, they wore red bandanas around their necks to recall the miners of Blair Mountain. So it's been a continuing tradition. Anyway, federal troops were eventually brought in. The miners surrendered. There was a series of treason trials which took place thereafter. And the mine wars kind of fizzled out after that. So that's a very quick nutshell of what happened.
Yeah, and it's rare that me and Jacob don't try to interject somewhere, but we're both sitting here like children in a schoolhouse.
All right, folks. So one of the things that we want to do on the program is encourage people to share their experiences in the workplace so that y'all know that you're not alone and we're not alone. We all have really terrible experiences at work, and it doesn't have to be that way. To facilitate this, in this clip from way back when Adam was first starting to transition into the show, he and I talk about a couple of our own bad boss stories.
We have opened the line for boss bashing, and so Adam and I,
and
to
if
close
you're
it out,
watching on YouTube, this is exactly how we plan out the show. We're talking in the commercial break. What are we going to do on the next segment?
That's right.
We're very good at just making it up as we go along. That's an essential skill in life.
So Adam and I are going to close it out with our bad boss stories. So I worked for years in the restaurant industry, and the restaurant industry is the industry that is currently, the restaurant bosses, their tears are flowing right now because their tears.
Boo-hoo.
Yeah, the restaurant bosses' tears are flowing right now because it is not as easy. It's still not impossible, but it is not as easy for them to lord homelessness and starvation over their workers, and so they're having a difficult time getting people to work for $2 to $10 an hour at their restaurants. So they're crying a lot. I worked in the restaurant industry for 3 years. What's that?
What was that first number you said?
What first number?
Of the salary for restaurant workers.
$2 to $10 an hour.
For tipped restaurant workers. I wonder how many people recognize. So tell people how much.
Yes.
When people refuse to tip at a restaurant,
right.
Tell them how much your waiter or waitress is making per hour.
Yeah, $2.13 an hour is what I made for the whole time that I was a server. I eventually got promoted to shift manager, which is, not really actually management. You're just kind of like a team lead. And you know what I made when I was a shift manager? I made a cool $5.45 an hour.
Ooh, look at you, big shot.
I was a big shot being a shift manager.
You'd be surprised how many people will take a pay cut to call themselves a manager.
Yeah. No, that was a pay raise because I was making $2 an hour.
I have worked with people that will take a pay cut just so they feel important.
Yeah, keep an eye on those people.
Yeah.
They worry me.
Literally, our hourly workers make more than our first line managers.
Jeez.
And there's been several people that would take those
that take the job. That's crazy.
Just so they can call.
Some people really like power.
Yes, exactly.
So I didn't have any power. It was just more work. That was all that I had for my position as a shift manager. I just had to, in addition to waiting tables while I was a shift manager, I had to make sure that everybody in the back was doing what they needed to do. If somebody didn't show up in the back, then I had to go back and cook burgers while I was waiting tables. And I also had to order the groceries that night. And I also had to make sure that the numbers matched at the end of the night. And I also had to lock up, be the last one to leave for $5 an hour. And you don't make minimum wage after you stop taking tables. You still continue to make $2 an hour if you're a server while you're closing the restaurant, $5 an hour as a manager while I'm closing the restaurant, not making tips. It's BS. Our boss there.
So you would make, if you worked 8-hour day, you would make two $20 bills.
An 8-hour day at $5 an hour would be $40. Yeah. At $2 an hour, it would be $16.
Yeah. I mean,
but most of that, when you actually get your paycheck, is zeroed out because all of your because you get to take home your tips at the end of the day, but your tips, the credit card tips at least, are automatically counted on your forms, and so taxes are taken out from your tips and from your $2 an hour, all of that from your $2 an hour. So I had multiple occasions gotten $0 to $2 checks for 80 to 100 hours of work.
Yeah,
a $0 check for 100 hours of work over the course of 2 weeks.
That is insane. And for anybody that says, if you don't like it, go somewhere else, well, guess what? Man. There's going to be somebody else that has to take
Somebody's got to do it. Somebody's got to do it. So our boss, not our general manager, he did have hiring and firing power, but he didn't make a whole lot of money either. He was a great guy, loved our general manager. The boss, man, the guy who owned the place, I worked at this restaurant for more than 3 years. Do you know how many times I saw the guy who owned the restaurant?
Twice.
Maybe 4 times over the course of 3 years. And yet...
You're telling me he didn't work? He didn't work?
And yet... I only saw him 4 times over the course of 3 years. And yet, the funniest thing, he had 2 houses and a jet ski, and most of my coworkers were on food stamps and in Section 8 housing. I don't know how it is that he showed up at this restaurant 4 times a year, but he had 2 houses, and those of us who put in 100 hours every 2 weeks were on food stamps and in Section 8 housing, and couldn't afford to, could barely afford to put food on the table. So that's my bad boss story.
Well, I think when they call them job creators, maybe they're talking about the people who build yachts and jet skis and gated communities, right?
Maybe.
I spent several years in the restaurant and service industry, so I definitely relate to what Jacob just shared. One that I want to point out is Sonic Drive-In. Primarily the ladies who bring you your ice cream and milkshakes are actually tipped employees. So even though it's a fast food restaurant, and they're lucky to get whatever change is left over at the end of the order, they are not paid minimum wage. They are relying on tips. In the restaurant industry, yes, they are griping and moaning like big babies because they are having they're struggling to fill staff right now.
And we are loving, I just want to make it clear, we are loving every second of it. Every time I see one of these articles where there's a business owner crying about not being able to fill jobs for starvation wages, I lap it up. I get my big mug of Boss Tears. Ben Shapiro has his leftist tears mug. I've got a big old, comically large sized mug of Boss Tears that I drink from, and it sustains me.
Well, for years, all we've heard about is how the free market is the most wonderful thing. Well, I guess your free market is not working the way you like it to right now.
Right. I mean, this is the market at work. People are having options, and guess what? Signing up to work at your restaurant for $8 an hour with unpredictable scheduling, where you may not know what your schedule is from day to day. You're gonna come in, you're gonna get treated like crap by some petty manager, with a power trip. Yeah. You're going to get treated like crap by a lot of customers, unfortunately, who, feel misery in their own life because they're being exploited. So they want to take it out on somebody, and it's probably you taking their order. The cuts and scrapes, the burns. I remember having to work on Christmas Day and having a line wrapped around the building from the moment I walked in to the moment we walked out and officially turned the lights off. Cleaning the grill and then hot grease splattering all over my face is a little parting Christmas gift for me.
Yeah, and one of the misconceptions, and it's talked about a lot, is that there is no union for service workers. There is no union specifically for restaurant workers. And guess what, folks? We organize in the restaurant industry. We have a union in Huntsville that you can join today. Right now, Jacob's got the stamps with him. If
That's
not,
right.
Huh?
I do.
There you go. You can join today, and we will teach you how to organize your coworkers and how to form a union in a restaurant, in the service industry, in the janitorial industry, in all of these industries where they say, I've never heard of a union being in there, so there's a misconception that there's not one. That's a fault. That's a misnomer. We will help you. All you have to do is contact us.
And if there's not one, you haven't seen one, that's just a sign that you need one.
Yeah.
The following clip was a pretty meandering conversation, but I think an enjoyable one to listen to, sparked by a caller about how companies just really don't care about their employees. I think that's something that folks really need to take to heart. Let's listen.
We got somebody else wanted to get in on the boss bashing hotline on this International Workers' Day.
We got about 2 minutes.
We got about, well, you know what? Yeah, we got about 2 minutes. Well, let's get in there and we let's get you in here. And if you if it goes longer, we can bring you in on the other side of the break. We had it was Michael from North Carolina. Michael, what you got for us?
Hey, how's it going? Listen, happy May Day from beautiful Western North Carolina. How is everybody today?
All right.
Oh, man, I'm doing good.
Welcome.
I just wanted to call and say how much I appreciate what y'all are doing, how important it is, and how much of a rich labor history we have here in the South.
Yes.
And for putting the red back in redneck.
There you go.
Hell yeah.
Truth.
I just want to say I'm tired of seeing all my Southern brothers and sisters licking boots and kissing ass to the boss. And my experience through this pandemic is I won't say what I do, but I was really essential, and we were just thrown to the wolves.
Yeah.
They didn't even mandate masks until about 4 or 5 months ago.
Yeah.
So I just want to say they don't care about you. They'd rather make money, and if you died, they'd have somebody doing it for you the next day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
They only care about
solidarity
you.
with y'all.
Yeah, they only care about you to the extent that you are able to profit, make profits for them. At that point, then it's over with.
That's right, David. So listen, I just wanted to say thank y'all and happy May Day, and I hope you have a good weekend and keep up the good work.
Thanks for calling, bro.
Thanks,
so
brother.
much.
Appreciate it. Happy May Day. Yeah. That's exactly right. And, you know, that's important for folks to understand, like thinking that you've got a commitment to an employer or something. You know, I was talking to somebody yesterday about these coal miners going on strike, and they said that they just didn't feel like it was right because they agreed to do a job and now they're not doing a job and they agreed to it. And it's like, they agreed to do the job in the same way that the company agreed to pay them, which is at any time and for any reason revocable because we live in an at-will state. And if you don't think for a second that the minute it becomes just inconvenient, not even you're taking food off their table, the second it becomes inconvenient for a company to continue to hire you, you're gone.
Well, they agreed to do a job under a previous contract where they were paid $7 and $8 an hour more.
Right.
And they gave up that $7 or $8 an hour to profit the company.
Yeah.
Now they're asking for it back.
Yeah. We'll be right back. This is the Valley Labor Report.
You're listening to the Valley Labor Report.
This is the Valley Labor Report, live online and on the radio from Athens, Alabama. We are coming to you on this International Workers' Day, the real Labor Day, May the 1st. It is May Day, everybody, and we have opened the lines for boss bashing on International Workers' Day. The phone number is 1-866-494-9866 if you want to get in on that. So... yeah, you know, I want to dwell on that the mine worker stuff a little bit more and preview. I can't lay everything out on the table that we've got planned, but we've got some cool stuff planned, I think, for the next couple of weeks, and I'm just going to give you a little bit of tidbit of what we've got in mind. But yeah, the mine workers, we've gone over this before, and so I won't dwell on it too much, exactly the history, but they took huge concessions, including an $8 an hour pay cut, to save the company. The company was saved, and now they want parity with other coal miners. They want what they had back before the company went bankrupt. They're not asking for anything crazy. That's something that they've stressed over and over and over when I've talked to them. They just want what they had before. Currently, they're making what miners did back in the 90s. I mean, it's not fair what they're being asked to accept. And the idea that
Look, if all these other supervisors and managers and owners are making what they were making before, why not? What's fair? At what point is it no longer fair for everybody else in this company to make more plus $30,000 a quarter bonuses? $30,000 per quarter bonuses for the supervisors out there, and we don't want to pay the workers a dime more. The actual people that shovel that coal out of the hole 2 miles deep,
risking their lives.
Their lives. We've got. I know of at least one memorial for mine workers that passed away in 2001. They are the ones that generate the profits. If there's one group that deserves a fair share to be paid,
it's coal miners.
It is the people that are shoveling that coal out, and those are tough folks. I would never want to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I wouldn't want to do it. And I mean, it really why should the better question is not the question folks ought to be asking is not, well, why don't they just do the job that they signed up for? It's why don't the executives, why don't they make a reasonable wage? Why did they get $4 million a year? Why did they get 5, 10, 20, $1 billion a year? What did they do to earn that? They didn't go 2 miles below the surface of the earth every day, 6-7 days a week for 10 hours a day without a paid lunch break. They didn't work for it. They just sit on money, and they get more money through other people's wages and through investments, and they buy products of other people's labor. They didn't do anything for it, by and large. In a lot of these instances, you can talk to me about how maybe there are some, in a lot of, especially in these big companies, the CEOs, they basically outsource the actual executive and administrative work to the board of directors or to middle managers or things like that.
Consulting firms that they bring in.
Yeah. So in a lot of these places, they're literally not doing anything. But let's say even that a boss, there is some executive and administrative work that has to be done in a company. Okay, we can compensate them for that. Is that work worth more than 300 times the median employee of a given company? No, of course not.
They're the welfare class.
They
are the welfare class.
Exactly. They
are living off the labor of other people.
Exactly. Whatever work you can show me that an executive of any given firm does, you cannot make me believe that it is 300 times more valuable than the work of the median laborer. I'm not even talking about the average CEO to median worker ratio in this country is 320 to 1. It's not CEO to the lowest paid worker. It's CEO to the median worker is 320 to 1, and that is the average. In some companies, the disparity is 1,000 to 1. That is absurd.
And we don't hate these people. Let's point out the fact that everybody deserves a living wage.
Sure.
We don't think that
they should be homeless.
No, but there should be a shared wage.
Right.
There should be a share of the profits. And at the point that they don't want to share the profits, I'm of the opinion that we should take over the businesses and the workers should run the business. You don't deserve to make this amount of money, this obscene profits, while people are living in squalor, while people are having to work more than one job. It's unfathomable that in this country, in the richest country in the world, that this continues to happen, and that the people that work alongside them, maybe in another industry, actually take up for these rich CEOs that don't even live in your state, that don't pay taxes in your state, that don't pay for your kids' T-ball shirts whenever they need shirts printed. It's exploitation at the utmost level, and it's sickening that there's bootlickers out there that work just like the rest of us and will take up for these companies.
Yeah. I mean, there's just no sense in it. They don't, Elon Musk doesn't know your name. He doesn't care about you, right? So all of your bootlicking online is not gonna, make him notice you, right? I mean, it's not. I
actually read last week that he has filed with the SEC to change his name on the ownership papers of one of his companies. I can't remember which one. To Techno Lord.
Yeah.
Techno Lord.
And
is it
delusional?
Is it no wonder that he thinks he's a king?
And the mythology around him is so crazy. I brought up Elon Musk but the mythology around him is insane. It's like they reckon he's some like startup guy who he was poor and he started a company in his garage. His parents own emerald mines. They owned emerald mines in apartheid South Africa.
Yeah.
Apartheid South Africa.
Wonder what those conditions were like.
Yeah, that's like getting rich off of convict lease labor in the Jim Crow South on a cotton plantation, and then having he didn't. It just blows my mind that people think that he deserves billions of dollars to be the second most.
And most of his business is funded by government funds.
Yes.
Most of his business is funded by the taxpayers. They raise him up as some type of private. What would you call
entrepreneur?
Entrepreneur, yeah.
But most of his funds come from taxpayer dollars,
right.
Subsidies from the government. So,
right. In the form of contracts that they have with the federal government, and in the form of like literal tax subsidies and grants and bailouts and things like that.
He's the P.T. Barnum of our time.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, even down here in Alabama, all these jobs that they brag about growing and bringing here, almost in every case, it is a slew of tax subsidies, tax write-offs. I mean, it is a form of legal bribery.
Yeah.
They are bribing these companies to come down here. And, of course, they're advertising that we have non-union labor, by and large. And I think all this illustrates why it is so important that we grow the labor movement and that we actually build power among ordinary working people, because the trends have gotten worse. It has gotten worse over the past 50 years. These disparities that you're talking about with CEO pay, and wealth inequality, period. So that's why it is so. That's why we do what we do, because we want to grow our numbers.
And that's illustrated in the data of like CEO to worker pay, but it's illustrated in the anecdotal story of the mine workers here in Alabama. If you listen to our episode that we collaborated with Working People on, Lee said that one of his friends talked like his grandfather told him that what the company is asking these folks to work for is less than they made in the 90s at the same coal mine. And this is after 2 years of record-breaking production and profit for this company, after 6 years of enormous concessions by the workers. And so they're still on strike. They've been on strike now for 4 or 5 weeks.
This is the fifth week.
Fifth week, and it looks like they're going to be on strike for quite a while more. And so they're going to need all of our support, and I reckon it's looking like it's going to be a knockdown, drag out kind of thing, and it costs money to keep these people fed, because they don't get paychecks from the company while they're out on strike. They get strike checks from the union, which are like heavily diminished from what they would get when they were working. I don't know exactly what it is, but they get some funds from the union, but and the union in addition to that also tries to make sure that they're kept fed, and they have water and Gatorade and stuff on the picket lines, and that's costing a lot of money.
And let me tell you this, when there's people out there, and especially people in the state of Alabama, that says, why should we support the mine workers? Why should we care about them getting a raise? I'll tell you why. Because the money that they get from that raise will go directly back into our community and into our state, as opposed to going to some Wall Street executives.
That's right.
Some hedge funding, venture capitalists in some faraway state. The money that these folks will make will go directly back into our community. And that is important.
Yeah.
That is the most important thing that we can do in our state, is to raise the wages, because when we raise the wages in the state, we are creating more consumers. They are spending more money. They're buying more vehicles. They're going out to eat more. The money that the company makes is not going back into the community. It's going into somebody's private jet.
Yeah.
It's going into more investments into stock markets that you'll never see. We've got to pay more people more money. And you say, well, if we pay the waitresses at Ruby Tuesdays an extra $2 an hour, it's going to cost us more to eat there. Yeah, it's going to cost us a few cents more per meal to eat there. The amount of money that we will generate back into the community by paying them more will increase the economy in the state of Alabama. Don't let these idiot right-wing conservative people tell you that it's going to take money out of your pockets. It's not.
Alrighty, folks, to round out this special episode of Old Clips, we have a fairly recent interview with Professor Ahmed White, talking about the history of mass picketing in the United States. Like I said, I didn't think that this got enough love when we went live with it. I think it's very important, considering how considering the reinvigoration of the labor movement and what it's going to take for people to win. Right? It's not just enough to win a union election. Winning a union election is actually, that doesn't change. That in and of itself does not change people's lives materially. We've got to win better contracts, or we've got to win things outside of contracts that actually materially make people's lives better. And mass picketing is a tactic that people in the past used a lot and is never used anymore. And so we talked to Professor White about that.
Even though in historical context, if you look over the last 100 years or so, 2021 wasn't particularly noteworthy, there was certainly a different feel and a different tone in the coverage as workers from coal miners to grad students and factory workers to cereal makers went on strike. A common theme that arose from these strikes was the widespread use of injunctions. If you listen to the show, you know intimately about the struggle that the coal miners in Brookwood have faced with these particularly repressive orders from the state, restricting them to 10 to 11 workers on the picket line at first, and then to 6, then banning the practice altogether. Now, the state has graciously allowed the coal miners in Bessemer, in Brookwood, to have 2 people on the picket line. We're so thankful to the state, to our overlords in the government. John Deere workers and Kellogg's workers also saw this tactic used against them as well. And so I'm watching Striketober unfold, right, like everybody else, and the boss making use of state power to repress protests that can, in almost no case, be called mass pickets. And I thought that it would be interesting to learn more about the history of state repression of the picket, and specifically the repression of mass picketing. My friend Daniel, who is in law school, recommended looking up our next guest, and I was not disappointed. Mr. Ahmed White is a professor of law and the Nicholas Rosenbaum Professor of Law Chair at the University of Colorado. He got his law degree at Yale, and he has been doing a lot of work lately on the history of law and labor relations. He is the author of a book and the author of an upcoming book titled Under the Iron Heel, The Wobblies in the Capitalist War on Radical Workers. Mr. White, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Great. So a lot of your work focuses on mass picketing as a tactic and its successes and defeat. The injunctions that were issued against working folks last year and are still in effect for our sisters and brothers in Brookwood, they weren't actually responses to anything that could be reasonably be called mass pickets, right?
That's right. I mean, mass pickets or mass picketing is an inherently ambiguous concept. No one has a definite notion of where mass picketing begins or ends, but the instances here were not particularly indicative of that, and that's typical when you get these injunctions. They're actually seldom premised on mass picketing, because mass picketing isn't engaged in very often by workers anymore.
So what is a mass picket then?
Well, again, it's never been perfectly clear what mass picketing is. There's a long history in this country of banning picketing. And until the 1930s, these bans on picketing, often by judges in the form of injunctions, were seldom contested, were usually regarded as perfectly legitimate. In the 1930s, when there was a round of reformist legislation passed in Congress, picketing became, let's say, presumptively legal. When there was, by the 1940s, a kind of concerted backlash against that and against labor rights in general, one of the issues that the enemies of organized labor raised was the specter of mass picketing. And they, meaning people in Congress, including those who ultimately secured the enactment of the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, never had a clear idea what mass picketing was or wasn't. They figured correctly that if they could ban it in some way or another, the risks of mass picketing and the cost inherent in that ambiguous definition would fall on workers. In other words, if there were doubts whether picketing was mass picketing or not, workers would bear the burdens of that.
I see. So the mass picketing, as how would you define it then? Like in your research, when you're looking at mass picketing, what are the kind of things that you were looking at?
Well, the one factor is just size, but again, that's not reducible to any particular number. It never really has. Under federal law, mass picketing is banned by Section 8B1 of the National Labor Relations Act. There's a kind of interesting story there because the ban there isn't an explicit one. It's implicit. It's a matter of the legislative history and intent, and the courts and the NLRB have taken that for granted. So if you read 8B1, it doesn't say anything about mass picketing. Instead, it talks about unions or their agents acting in a coercive way or interfering with or restraining other workers in their exercise of their right not to be involved in union activity. That's been interpreted as the Congress intended to bar mass picketing. But again, there's no particular number that defines what mass picketing is. Instead, the National Labor Relations Board and the courts enforcing that federal provision tend to look at how coercive or how restraining or how much the protest activity interferes with the right of other workers. It's a very vague and ambiguous concept. Mm-hmm. I think that's how it's intended, and that works to the benefit of employers and their allies.
Right. And that's basically, the quote unquote rights of workers not to engage in union activity. This is more or less the right to cross a picket line that this section of the NLRA is supposed to be protecting. And so that is one way that maybe we can think about mass picketing as differentiated from normal picketing, is that it is more difficult for a worker to actually cross that picket line, like physically, because there's so many people there that you just can't cross it, right?
That's right. Brass tacks, that's what it's about. And if you look at the early cases interpreting this provision, the federal provision, it didn't take much. I mean, the kind of slightest interference with even inconvenience with the right of a scab to cross the line was for some courts quite enough. And that was a big change in a short period of time in federal labor law. When the National Labor Relations Act, the Wagner Act, was first enacted in 1935 and first became effective in the late 1930s, it wasn't difficult to find courts who were, let's just say, far more realistic about this issue and about the realities of picketing and what it took for a picket line to be effective. And therefore, we're not so quick to say just because someone was somewhat inconvenienced, that therefore something terrible happened. Now, back then, the issue was whether an employer could fire a striker or a picketer because that person interfered with someone who was crossing the picket line. That's still an issue. But nowadays, after Taft-Hartley, there's also the question of whether the employer or the NLRB ultimately could find that an unfair labor practice had occurred and essentially itself enjoin the picketing.
Mm-hmm. And so I think one of the things that even a lot of the public kind of just accepts is that people should have a right to cross a picket line. People should have, that's something that I think a lot of people and companies should have a right, quote unquote, to operate their business during a strike. How would workers who engaged in mass picketing, who did not allow strikebreakers, scabs, to cross the picket line because of their numbers primarily? I mean, it was not, people talk about union thugs, and that was not the primary means by which scabs were prevented from crossing the picket line. It was just that it was physically not possible to do that. And there were also sit-down strikes and things like this. How would workers who did that defend these actions?
Well, you put your finger on something really interesting, and that is the kind of historical function of mass picketing in elevating the labor movement during this crucial period of growth in the 1930s, late 1930s and through the 1940s. Mass picketing was effective, as you mentioned, because of the mere numbers. And usually, heyday of mass picketing, we might call the period in the few years after the end of the Second World War, when there were a great number of strikes, the biggest strike wave in American history by far, with a great number of those strikes involving mass picketing. There was actually very little violence and very, almost no serious violence. And what that reflects is the fact that mass picketing worked not because people were being beaten up, that happened occasionally, but usually because mass picketing signaled to people who would cross a picket line that they shouldn't. Some of them were intimidated, I'm sure. Some of them merely responded to the theater of it all. Was an indication of how many of their fellow workers were on the side of the union, and for them that maybe they should reconsider their thoughts about the underlying issue that provoked the strike. And that's why, when it comes down to it, mass picketing was banned at the federal level with Taft-Hartley. It was very effective at making the union movement a meaningful force in American politics and economics. Without mass picketing, the question is, how can strikes be effective? A strike is a withholding of labor. For some workers in some circumstances, that's enough. But for a lot of American workers, it's not, particularly where employers have a very broad right to bring in replacement workers, either temporary replacements or, if it's an economic strike, of course, permanent replacements. That raises a question: how can you win a strike if you're limited to 2 or 5 or 7 or whatever people on a picket line patrolling in a way that some court has prescribed, or even don't have an injunction? You're worried that if you bring too many people on the picket line, the employer's going to go and file an unfair labor practice charge against the National Labor Relations Board.
Right. So we've got about 3 or 4 more minutes on the radio, and then we're going to continue. So, folks, if you're listening to us on the radio, you can find us online. We're on Facebook. We're on YouTube at the Valley Labor Report. You can continue to listen to this conversation that we're having with Professor Ahmed White from the University of Colorado about the history of mass picketing in the United States. And the last thing that I wanted to, and we'll wrap the interview here for the radio, is the injunctions that we saw in 2021. What is the basis for them? Because like I said, these are not mass pickets. These are not pickets that are preventing people from crossing the picket line. And they still had the state come down and say, too much. What is the deal there?
So that's very interesting and I think quite important. So what I found in studying the use of injunctions in labor cases is a consistent theme. And that is the ability of the people seeking these injunctions, employers, to premise the injunction on an anticipation of violence and disorder that is often at least far, far, far removed from any present indication that there would be violence or disorder. And the courts have consistently accepted that argument. So what you have here is a situation where courts, again, routinely issue these injunctions, and they have for decades now, without there being much proof at all that any kind of trouble is in the offing. It's this anticipation that there would be trouble. And that's been true of the way the NLRB has enforced this Section 8B1, in other words, the federal limitations on mass picketing, but it's also been true as your question and your introduction to this segment indicates, in the great number of cases where state courts have done what state courts can do separate from the NLRB, and that is to issue their own injunctions. It's this anticipation of violence and disorder, even when it's not in the offing, even when it's a distant threat, if any threat at all. The one other thing I would say, if we have a moment to say this, is that this all happens in a context where employers or their allies very frequently provoke whatever kind of disorder there may be anyway. And when they do that, they provide themselves with a basis for the issuance of these injunctions and never pay much of a price for it.
I got to say, I am very just excited to even learn about you, honestly. I was telling the rest of the crew here this morning, it's always great to find out new people who are and you're not new, you're just new to me, but experts in this. And, you know, I'm looking at your bio here at the University of Colorado, and it's like right up our alley. So it's going to be fun to dig into some of your research. And before you go, I definitely wanted you to have an opportunity to just share, give us sort of a high level summary of what has been the focus of your research as a professor of law focused on unions. What have you been looking at? And, maybe what are some of the most, what are the things you've studied throughout the past that seem to resonate so much in 2022?
Good question. So my work, I started out writing about criminal law, and I got kind of bored with that. I think that's kind of a dead end field to work on if you're a leftist. I mean, if your critique is just a liberal critique, there's always something to say, and I agree with a lot of what people say. But I gradually got more and more into labor stuff, and my focus has come to be labor repression. The different ways that labor is repressed. And what I've come to see is, or what I've come to understand is something I always knew was true, and that is the kind of inherent bias of the state and the legal system. So most of the work I've done kind of culminates in something like that, the sort of limits of the liberal system of labor rights and the way that contributes to a just kind of comprehensive system of repression, and one that, as you both know, it doesn't bar all kinds of labor protest all the time, but it certainly does bar the most effective kinds of protest all the time. And if I had to sum up everything I've done, that's what it comes down to. And, it's interesting because I'm just confirming what I knew to be true when I was 17.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. And that's sort of, to think about why Jacob even was looking for you and invited you on the show, because we were watching this happening in Brookwood, and, we know the facts on the ground there. And it's just nice to hear from somebody who has seen this and studied it for a long time and documented how this has been an ongoing pattern. And I think that's important, because sometimes people see the government as sort of this like neutral force that is pushed and pulled in different directions. But, in the case of the labor movement, especially, but I think in a lot of areas, it's very clearly not. I mean, it's very clear what side they're on, and it's not our side. And that's something that we have to deal with, in our organizing. We have to factor that in. And
that's exactly right. I mean, one of the most exasperating things in dealing with, you name it, other academics, especially in law, but other sort of mainstream media people or whoever, is this sense that when the state's against labor, I mean, nobody can deny, unless they're total reactionary, that the state's often on the side of employers. But what's exasperating is how often people want to believe that that's just an exceptional thing. That's an aberration.
Maybe they had a good reason that time, right?
Yeah, it's like,
or maybe that's how it's supposed to be.
Yeah, this isn't something to say on radio, but the best analogy might be to like an abusive partner. Like if the abuse is always there, then this person doesn't love you. You know where they stand. They're fundamentally against you. And I wish people thought that same way about the state and about the legal system. That these are not aberrations. These are instances of the state telling you where it really stands. And I wish people better outside of circles like this one, better understood that.
Right. Well, yeah. So let's, we're not constrained by, breaks or anything like this now. So let's back up a little bit, because you mentioned that the law and the state has consistently banned the most effective sorts of protest and picketing, and mass picketing, for an example, sit-down strikes, for an example. So let's illustrate for a bit, and you do that in one of your articles, and I would recommend folks. I mean, it's like it's a scholarly article. The title is "Workers Disarmed," and the link is in the show notes. But it's a fantastic article, and you do that in this article and you lay out how effective mass picketing specifically was for working folks. So can you tell us about its rise as a tactic and illustrate its successfulness for us?
Yeah, so before the 1930s, workers did whatever they could in a context where almost everything they engaged in was presumptively or potentially illegal. That changed in the 30s. But what didn't initially change, in other words, you got this law enacted in 1935 that seemed to protect workers' rights to organize, to engage in protests, and collective bargaining. For a couple of years, most big employers just ignored that while trying to get the Supreme Court to declare it unconstitutional. And there's a great story, an important story in American history about how workers responded to that by organizing, by saying, well, we're going to make the law effective. The law isn't giving us rights. We're going to assert those rights and make the law effective. And so that's the story. That's a story of mass picketing, but also of sit-down strikes. And so you had this massive wave of sit-down strikes beginning in late 1936 and through the first half of 1937. And some of my colleagues, Jim Pope and Drew Hansen, have argued persuasively, I think, that this was a major, major reason that the Wagner Act was found constitutional by the Supreme Court in April of 1933. 1947. Anyway, just to answer your question, no sooner that happened than the courts and the police started cracking down on sit-down strikes. And in 1939, the Supreme Court basically ruled sit-down strikes were illegal. They followed that up in 1942 with another case involving some workers striking on a ship that kind of put the nail in the coffin of sit-down strikes. Said sit-down strikes are basically almost categorically illegal. In that context, workers turn more and more to mass picketing as an effective means of asserting labor rights. So the Wagner Act is constitutional, but as we all know, the Wagner Act doesn't give workers a contract. It doesn't compel employers to recognize them unless they've got a majority of workers signed up. So you still got to be active and effective, and that's where workers turn to mass picketing. And it really blossomed in the early 1940s and into the mid 1940s and late 1940s as an effective tactic. And that's again why the Congress tried to declare it, did essentially declare it unconstitutional in 1947. And in the meantime, state courts were continuing to issue injunctions themselves, banning mass picketing or disruptive picketing or picketing they thought might become disruptive or whatever. And what they were able to do was gradually to get more and more license to do that in a context where initially there was some question whether state courts could still assert their jurisdiction in a world where now you've got a federal labor law that's governing labor relations. There was some question whether state courts' authority to issue injunctions would be preempted by this new federal law. In other words, barred because of the supremacy of the federal government. That was cleared up in the 1940s too, that state courts can issue these injunctions as long as they don't try to meddle with the particulars of the labor law. In other words, as long as they don't try to rewrite, as it were, the Wagner Act and its provisions. As long as their injunctions are focused on order and the threat of violence or interference with public access, as long as they're focused on that, they pretty much have carte blanche to issue injunctions.
Right.
Well, and as you mentioned, it can be based on just their imagining of anticipated threats or violence. It doesn't have to really be concretely tied to any real threats. They don't have to have evidence that, there's troublemakers preparing to make trouble. Just the fear. It seems to be enough to get the courts on their side. And, as you're talking, something that really resonates with me is that in the labor movement, we go back to the 30s often as kind of the peak of our power and our size, the 30s and immediate, post-war period. And so many of those weapons that we had tactically have been outlawed, from the mass picket to our, sympathy strikes and solidarity strikes. That, I think, has boxed us in as a movement. And there's, I think, been a natural trend to just operate within those legal confines. That it seems, it's kind of a natural thing. We institutionalize, we have official tax status, we have staffers with salaries, and so we got to follow the law. We can't be reckless. And it almost it feels, you brought up abusive relationship earlier as a metaphor. So I'm gonna bring this one up. Feels like we've been domesticated, and had our back broken a little bit, and we have to operate within these very strict confines. So that's a long way of leading me to my question, which would be, given that the mass picket and so many other tactics that we know worked in the past are illegal, should the labor movement be looking at taking the risk of, going outside those small, narrow legal confines, or should we be looking at, are there new tactics that they haven't figured out to ban yet that we need to be really focused on? I just don't know if you have any thoughts there, but I'd be curious to hear it.
Well, I think you raise a crucial question.
I know you are a professor of law, and I don't want you to say anything.
Saying get me in trouble, yeah. But no, you raise a crucial question, and one that I think has to be on the table. What is the value of being legal? And I'm not saying that to say, to endorse engaging in criminal acts or whatever. People have to decide for themselves what they're going to do in this world. But not everything that's illegal is criminal either. And some of my colleagues, a few of my colleagues among law professors, have begun to raise this issue. Like, what's the real value of the NLRB system to workers now? When, as you put it quite correctly, so much of what was effective 70, 80 years ago is illegal now anyway. When the NLRB and NLRA do as much to constrain what workers can do to limit workers' rights and prerogatives as they do to assist workers. And you noted, unions, if they are legitimate, have to have lawyers and staff. I mean, I completely understand that, being a lawyer myself. But one of the problems with that approach is, even to the extent that it works, who has the greater resources to play that game anyway? I mean, there are a lot of great labor lawyers out there. I know them, I respect them.
Yeah.
But legal representation costs a lot of money, a lot of time. Even if it worked perfectly, you're dealing with people, big employers, whose resources are often much, much, much more extensive. They can win that battle often even against the best, most conscientious, most sacrificial of labor lawyers on the union side of things. In terms of new tactics, I mean, I'm starting to get up there in years a little bit, and I don't know what's out there. I just know that since the advent of the internet and then social media, people have been, in the labor side, have been waiting for the next new thing, and it's never come. It's never quite come. That it was going to be the internet, and then email, and then the various social media platforms were going to replace the old tactics that were no longer effective. And I'm not denigrating those efforts. I'm just saying nothing's been a kind of panacea or the magic bullet yet. And I know there are a lot of really smart and conscientious often young organizers out there, and more power to them. Maybe something will come around and help change things. Just hasn't happened yet.
Right. Well, and the thing that has been the most effective, like you said, has been, withholding our labor and basically not allowing others to contribute their labor, where there are people that want to cross that picket line, and the rise of mass pickets is a tactic. You mentioned in your article that during a 1-year period that formed the core of, quote, American labor's greatest upsurge, there were 4,600 strikes, including some 5 million workers. 2021, Striketober, there were like 300 something strikes and some hundreds of thousands of workers, so, and we have multitudes more people in the country, several more workers, more than 100 million workers in this country. And so the difference there is huge. And when I asked you earlier, like, how did workers justify, because today this property rights and right to go cross a picket line is kind of taken for granted, and I think that was contested back then when workers decided to take this action to say no, like, we don't believe you have a right to cross our picket line. We don't believe that you have a right to work here while we are striking. Do you think that there was that they spent a whole lot of time philosophically and morally thinking through these things, and that there was a really sturdy justification in their minds, or that they just recognized that this was power, and it was more of a tactical calculation or a philosophical justification that they had in their minds? What do you think was going on when people did this?
Oh, a little of both. I mean, depending on who was involved. I mean, I think for people on the left wing of the labor movement, there was an attempt to ground this in leftist politics and philosophy. Whether you're talking about sort of IWW syndicalist or even kind of Communist Party types in the 1930s and 1940s. I think for the mainstream of the labor movement, it was largely a practical thing, but not entirely. I mean, if you look at, and I can say a little bit about this in the article you mentioned, if you look at the legislative history of the Taft-Hartley Act, when a number of these union people went and testified in Congress, some of them did make an effort to justify mass picketing, and it did seem at least somewhat earnest. You had Walter Reuther, who was, no radical, certainly not by 1947, basically reminding people in Congress that if you're going to talk about this issue in terms of violence and right and wrong in that sense, then he told them quite rightly they had the issue backwards. He said, let me remind you who, in so many words, he said, let me remind you who was doing the beating and the killing of people in this country. Not very long ago was, I think, the phrase he used, and quite rightly, in the 1930s, scores, probably a couple of hundred people altogether were killed in labor disputes, and the vast majority of them were on the union side. And the president of the Communications Workers Union, who was even further to the right, much more of a conventional trade unionist than Reuther, said something really interesting to Congress when they were debating mass picketing. He refused to condemn it. So these Republican congressmen were trying to box him in and say, we want you to condemn mass picketing. And he kept refusing to do it. And finally, kind of exasperated, he said something like, he said, I'm not going to sympathize. In so many words, he said, I'm not going to sympathize with a guy who is trying to cross the picket line. That's what you're trying to get me to do. He said, that guy is like the guy who won't obey the traffic rules, who decides that the red light is for other people and not for him. And I thought that was really interesting because that put a finger on something fundamental. Labor and labor rights are about solidarity. They don't work without solidarity. And this idea that was consecrated with Taft-Hartley, the right of dissidents, essentially of scabs, placement workers, whoever, freeloaders, not to go along with the union, is entirely antithetical to the very thing that is at the core of a functional labor movement, is business of solidarity. And this guy, Bill Burney, who was the president of the Communications Workers Union, he understood that. And I think everyone on some level in the labor movement back then understood that.
Well, and I think that there's a certain amount of maybe a belief that labor has a certain amount of democratic rights in the workplace, in the same way that, the traffic lights that he mentioned, there aren't traffic light trees that we have to obey by some natural law. They arise from ostensibly, ideally, democratic processes of electing governments and governments executing laws and city ordinances and things like this. And we have a democratic right to bind our neighbors to certain standards and to certain, and we have a right democratically to say that when this light is red, you can't go. I think that workers have a democratic right to say that, when the light is red, you can't go. You know, you can't. And the picket line is a red light. The picket line's a red light, and we are and when workers say democratically that there's a red light here, I think that is. I don't think that even today union members see. I don't think that they conceive of it in that way, and that they believe it has as much legitimacy as it ought to.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that is a great point, a tremendously important point. I mentioned a few minutes ago my friend and colleague Jim Pope. He's a law professor, just retired at Rutgers, and Jim wrote just a fascinating and very important article maybe a couple of decades ago about the sit-down strikes called Worker Lawmaking. I forget the journal it's in, but what Jim argued, I think this is just absolutely crucial. He looked at the history of these sit-down strikes, and he made, I think, the essential point that you have to look at what those workers were doing in those sit-down strikes as an exercise in lawmaking, not just any legal thing they were doing, which is the conventional way of seeing, they were violating the rights of private property and trespass and all of that. Jim said, no, look at them and look at the way they understood themselves what they were doing. They were trying to assert a different understanding of what the law meant or should mean, and one that was not any the less legitimate than the kinds of notions of private property or trespass that were being used against them. And you could say the very same thing about something like mass picketing, that workers have a prerogative, and to some extent back in the day they did, try to assert their notion of what is legitimate, what is disorderly, what is coercive, what is interfering with a person's right to go to work. What does the right to work even really mean? And I think if workers could recapture that, I'm not saying that's easy or that I have some program, but I think if workers could recapture that kind of spirit, it would go a long way towards revitalizing the labor movement. Again, it's not easy because a lot you can end up in jail doing this, or God forbid, seriously injured or killed on a picket line. That happened all the time 70, 80, 90 years ago. But if workers could recapture that spirit, it would go a long way towards rebuilding the labor movement.
Wow, I think there's a lot that y'all just discussed there that to me speaks to the social contract in the way in which, to the extent that we even have a social contract anymore that anyone could pinpoint, it's certainly been, I think, individualized and much less of a collective nature than it was 70, 80 years ago in the time period we're talking about. And another thing that you mentioned that I think is a major, difference between now and then was that there was a left. There was such a thing as the left, and it was, such a monumental part of the labor movement. And, as mass pickets and other tactics were outlawed, the left itself was purged from the labor movement. And, we've yet to recover from that. So I think those are some of the things that, if you look at these trends historically over the past 7-8 decades, we had our major weapons taken away. We had some of the, the most, energetic, perhaps, factions of the movement taken away by the purging of the left. And I think all those things have, again, go back to like the domestication piece of how the movement has changed from a militant and radical social movement that was, as you described and your colleague described, making his own law, essentially, to now much more institutionalized, much more dependent on, playing within the rules that are certainly not written for us or by us, but are for us to abide or else. So, those we could probably talk about this all day, but it just, those were some things that stuck out to me, and definitely we'll be looking up Jim Pope from Rutgers as well.
Yeah.
So,
No, that's
Professor, you're teaching us. I don't know how your week went, but at least on today, Saturday, you can be assured you taught some folks today.
Yeah, I was telling when Daniel suggested you, and I found you. It's like you couldn't have created somebody who was doing work more precisely about what I wanted to talk about. And so, these tactics effectiveness, there was a really strong, we've hit on some of the backlash to that, but there was a really strong incentive to undercut and delegitimize and push back against these tactics, either by hook or by crook, right?
Yes, most definitely. I mean, this was quite well organized. I mean, if I get your question right, if you look at the opposition to not just labor rights in general, but effective forms of labor protest, it was not only organized; it was well organized, and you could see that in the way it changed in reaction to different circumstances. So initially, when the Wagner Act was passed, the big employers' response was, we're gonna ignore this. This will go away. The Supreme Court had invalidated essentially most of the first New Deal. They'll invalidate this, and we'll pay some lawyers to bring that about. That failed. They changed their strategy almost overnight. The strategy was, okay, we'll get the Wagner Act repealed. And they spent the next decade from about 37 to 47 first trying to get it repealed. They saw that wasn't going to go anywhere. So then they thought, well, we don't have to get it repealed. We'll just get it amended. This will work to our advantage. And that gave rise to Taft-Hartley. And then I think for a couple of decades, they were more or less resigned to labor rights, to some level of functional labor rights. But as we all know, by the 1970s and 1980s, they changed their perspective again. And they said, what we'll do now is destroy the labor movement. And they have all but done that. If you look at union representation, it was organized at every level around the big employer associations, the Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers, the Business Roundtable, the big industry groups, the Iron and Steel Institute. It's amazing how well organized this always was.
In the state legislatures in DC and like I said, by hook or by crook, one of the things that you mentioned in the article, and I'll quote a bit here. Besides giving rise to the Memorial Day massacre mentioned at the outset of this article, clashes between SWOC picketers and police, company agents, and National Guardsmen left at least 6 and possibly 8 unionists dead and well over 300 people injured in Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. And there's not a single instance of quote-unquote union violence that looks like that. That's just not something that happens on the other side. And so you've got this assault on working people's rights to picket and to even exist as a union, as an organization all across the country. And so and like you said, that leaves us today with a situation where state judges in Tuscaloosa can say, people got their feelings hurt and they had feelings about fear or something. And so now we're going to limit the picket line to 2 people. Was as soon as mass picketing started becoming like de facto illegal, did we immediately see the anticipation of violence or intimidation or coercion used as a justification for these injunctions? Or did it take a little bit of time to get to where we are today?
It took some time, but one of the ironies here is that if you plotted out the serious violence, the rate of serious violence in labor relations in the United States, it remained quite high through the mid and late 1930s, and then it began to fall, and it fell dramatically. So only a relatively small number of people have been killed in labor disputes since the end of the Second World War. But what that did, and this is the irony of it, because of course no one's in favor of people getting seriously hurt or killed. But the irony here is that the threshold of what was tolerable in terms of violence has steadily ratcheted, or not just violence, but unrest has steadily ratcheted downward. So you can find in even in Supreme Court opinions, you mentioned the violence, quoting from the article of mine, violence in what was called the Little Steel Strike in 1937, where about 16 or 18 people were killed in different clashes. In the wake of that strike, you can find a U.S. Supreme Court opinion where the Supreme Court said, basically, if the labor law is going to function, the people administering it, including the courts, have to understand that there's going to be a certain level of disorder and a certain level of violence. And the court wasn't saying, it's a case about whether these strikers were entitled to be reinstated after this big strike. And the court validated the NLRB's ruling that most all of them had a right to be reinstated, even though the employers were saying they were the authors of violence. As you point out, the workers in the strike hadn't killed anybody. It was the employers and their agents and police who had killed 16, 18 people. Anyway, the Supreme Court said, look, you can't just say that workers involved in a strike that's violent are not entitled to be reinstated. Yeah, if someone tried to kill another person, that person is disentitled to reinstatement. But just because they were involved in a picket line fracas doesn't mean that the employer can deny them employment. That was in 1940 when the Supreme Court decided this case. As time has passed here, the threshold for the courts of what is intolerable disorder, what is sufficiently threatening of violence, has diminished further and further and further and further until you get kind of absurd things. Like you and I, Jacob, were talking about this earlier. The injunction issued here in Colorado against the King Soopers, the Kroger's picketers. I read the injunction and the claims that it was premised on, and they were absurd. Someone playing loud music in the store. Some people were, an epithet was supposedly, 8,000 people out on strike, and an epithet was supposedly, we don't know if that even happened. We don't know what the epithet was. The threshold of what is intolerable has worked its way so far downward now. As you've noted several times, quite rightly, that is the underpinning of so many of these devastating restrictions on picketing.
Right.
It's interesting to hear you describe that in terms of the Colorado pickets, because, I'm thinking back to my time as a high school teacher. And, if maybe managers at Kroger or the courts had ever just visited a high school hallway, they're going to hear more than one. They may hear some bad language and some yelling and some loud music and, folks being a little bit rowdy.
Yeah, good grief.
So maybe I'm biased. I am biased, but my guess is that picket line was no rowdier than most anywhere in our state on a Saturday in the fall during college football season. So it is absurd. But something that you mentioned about that Supreme Court ruling back in 1940 is that it seems to me that even justices of the Supreme Court, clearly, the elite of the elite had some recognition that there was conflict between employer and employee. I'm not saying that they were admitting that Marx was right. We have a bourgeoisie versus proletariat driving history. But, it seems like there was, among all sides, more of a understanding that there was contradiction there and there was conflict there. And in the 80 years since, it seems like we have done everything we can as a society and through media and culture to sort of mystify that contradiction and conflict and erase it from consciousness.
Oh, absolutely. If you look, there's an interesting kind of backstory here. The Supreme Court wasn't, in the late 30s and early 40s uniformly on labor side, as we know, but it was occasionally. And at the forefront of that, in the lead on the court, were some interesting figures. One of them was Alabama's own Hugo Black. You also had William O. Douglas, and then maybe the most fascinating of those people was a guy named Frank Murphy, who was the governor of Michigan during the big sit-down strikes, including the big GM sit-down strike in Flint in the winter of 36, 37. And he distinguished himself by he called out the National Guard, but he refused to unleash them on the sit-down strikers, and that abetted the UAW strikers in winning that strike. And then a few years later, he ends up on the Supreme Court, partly because his actions during that strike cost him the governorship in Michigan. And so Roosevelt put him on the Supreme Court. But these things are sort of interconnected in interesting ways. He was then the author of a case called Thornhill versus Alabama in 1940, which was the high water mark in the Supreme Court ruling that picketing was protected under the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Until that decision, it was not clear that people had a constitutional right to picket. And then this guy, Frank Murphy, authored the Supreme Court decision that said, yes, you absolutely do have a First Amendment right to engage in picketing. It was a labor case out of Tuscaloosa. And then every case after that the Supreme Court, just about every case after Thornhill that the Supreme Court decided on picketing, eroded that right, limited that right further. So there's some interesting interconnections there, and they rest on the fact that in a lot of ways, we think of progress as a kind of linear thing. In a lot of ways, the Supreme Court, some of these Supreme Court justices were further to the left, way further to the left, especially on labor issues back in the 1930s and 40s, than anybody you'll find on the court today.
Yeah, I was not familiar with that Alabama connection, so that's really cool. Appreciate you sharing that.
So, Professor White, I really, really appreciate your time. This has just been this has been fantastic. Exactly what I was looking for. Was there anything that you wanted to make sure that you mentioned before we wrapped up our conversation?
I can't think of anything. The main thing is just to thank you all for having me. It's been my pleasure.
What is you've got a book coming out in the next year or so, but you have a book already, and I'm planning on reading it. It's called The Last Great Strike, Little Steel, the CIO, and the Struggle for Labor Rights in New Deal America, University of California Press, 2016. Folks can check out that. Folks can check out your scholarly articles. Fantastic stuff there. And the new book that you've got coming out. You said it's in October. Is when you're expecting it to be released?
Should be out in October. Yep.
Under the Iron Heel, the Wobblies, and the Capitalist War on Radical Workers. We will hope to have you on again. Thank you for being so generous with your time. Absolutely. And have a great Saturday. Okay. Thanks, everybody, for listening to this special episode. I hope that we gave you something enjoyable to listen to as you're coming out of your Christmas food coma. We'll be back to our regularly scheduled live programming next week. Until then, solidarity forever.